Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gesha Village Lot 118 Natural Processed Ethiopia from Terraform Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Terraform, based out of Shanghai, China, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including our recent review of the Finca Soledad, the Tag Stater wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And this is actually the last Terraform coffee that we received from Airworks Coffee's special Terraform release, as I wanted to review at least one non-wash processed offering, and this coffee sounded the most in line with my own preferences, so it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe in a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, this coffee is very much in line with our previous experiences with Terraform coffees, as this one right here does remain on the lighter side of things, even with the processing on it. It's been kind of interesting just how consistent the roast profile has been along the coffees that we've reviewed from them up to this point. We've described them as being on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of Asian-based coffee roasters, but even then, it would still be considered light by European and American coffee standards, as these coffees are pretty light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression. And we did opt for the V60, and the cup definitely had a fair bit of the natural feel to it, as there was an ever so slight grainy quality with a little bit of fermentiness to the cup as well. It's reminiscent of some heavier stone fruit aspects, so it was an okay first impression. Honestly, I felt like this coffee probably just needed a little bit more time to settle, as this is the first one we'd experienced from Terraform that didn't necessarily have the level of clarity that we were hoping for from that first impression. Day 20 through the Chemex, and it was a little bit cleaner, as there was notably less of the graininess and fermentiness. Some of the prominent berry aspects are felt, with the cup continuing to offer a focus on these stone fruit-like components yet again. These first 2 days are pretty straightforward notes, as I just tried both these coffees and said it's what you'd expect from a first couple of times trying a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, especially one that may need a little bit more time, so not too much to pick out from this one. Day 23 through the April brewer, and the cup has even more of a difference to it relative to the previous days, as there's a still slight bit of graininess to it, but also yellow forward fruits, notably less of the berry tones, as the entire cup does feel a little less intense with a little bit more of a syrupy feel to the fruit tones. So I was already starting to see this coffee trending along some better lines, as I felt like maybe the lower extraction adjustments that we used for our April brewer might have really helped this coffee. So that's why I was curious to see what day 26 would bring for us, as we opted for Terraform's recipe, which once again is on the very low extraction side of things. And interestingly, it was the most funky the cup had been to this point, with yellow fruits offering notably more fermentiness to them in a lingering sense. So this was a very quick note-taking day once again, because I felt like I don't really want to dive too deep into this coffee, especially if it's just going to be offering less clarity and just much more heaviness to it, especially in a syrupy and fermenty sense. Day 29 through the Chemex with Terraform's recipe, and this was the most intense it had been to this point, as interestingly it was offering a Diego Bermudez Paraíso-like intensity to the stone fruits with a stronger mango yellow fruit tone, plenty of syrupiness to the cup again, but better overall. And I mentioned that Diego Bermudez experience, as I mentioned in the past, some of the very early versions of Diego Bermudez's coffees, I'm thinking of these black and white El Paraíso coffees, had this just kind of strange funkiness to it that I only experienced from those coffees and some of Diego Bermudez's other coffees from that point going forward. And it's this just kind of very funky mango-like feel to it. And that's what I was experiencing within this coffee. And since it reminded me so much of that, I really wanted to highlight that point, as that was interestingly a little bit more prominent within this coffee from this point going forward than I might have expected. As on day 32, we decided to go back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and it feels like this is the Terraform coffee we've been working on that has actually improved the most right from the start, as this coffee, given it had, I would say, a relatively mediocre first impression, has really seemed to improve with the same recipe that we opted for that first try. in a notably more intense sense, as there's a peachiness to the cup with a complementary lighter floral aspect and some sweeter citric tones, all with a very nice syrupiness to it. Not quite as good as the previous day with the Chemex, but nonetheless, I just felt like this coffee drastically improved from some of the earlier impressions, as there was notably more clarity to it. Day 35 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was a mixed result, as the cup does offer plenty of the previously mentioned fruit-forward components. Additionally, there are some struggles in the finish itself, as it has a slightly metallic tone to it with a little bit of some bitterness. It was a possible brewing error, but I decided to stick to the V60 from this point going forward, as those were some off-putting results within that one. And on day 38, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was the best that it had been to this point. So I said, okay, I think we have a success, as we finally found something that seems to be working really well for this coffee, as it's a bit more reminiscent of a classic Gesha-like feel with plenty of the fruit intensity to it. I should say, even then, a natural classic Gesha-like feel to it, as there's a higher level of better defined white florals with a sugary stone fruit-like feel, sugary citrus as well, a slight off bitterness in the finish, but as a result, it was significantly better, given that with the exception of that slight off component to it, it was much better rounded, much more intense, and much better defined with notably more clarity. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so we'll actually start with the cleanliness level 4, which is always very important when it comes to natural processed coffees. And I think I could say that for the majority of the time working through this coffee, it was a struggle and a battle to get this coffee to a level 4, mostly because right at the forefront there was plenty of graininess to it, but that did seem to dissipate with time. There was plenty of fermentiness and funkiness to it, but once again, that seemed to dissipate with some adjustments. So we were able to get it to a point where the definition of this coffee was enough to justify it being there at the level 4 mark. And interestingly enough, a lot of the fermentiness and funkiness to it died down over time. So I'm actually very happy with that scoring at that level 4, given that I didn't ever expect it to get there, especially based on some of the earlier experiences we'd had with this one. Finish level 4, and the finish has some mixed results to it, because I mentioned that there's kind of this off feel to the finish of this coffee, and some people felt this with the Rumudamo specifically, which didn't seem to be as much of a hindering quality to me with that coffee. But this one was a little bit of an exception to that, as I did feel that slight metallic-like feel to it, and that just bitter metallic feel at times as well, because I mentioned on that final day that it has this slight off bitterness to it. That's kind of the best way I can describe it. So finish, not necessarily the best part of this coffee, but given that I would say the majority of this coffee has a much nicer feel to it, then I'm willing to kind of overlook that part of it. Sweetness, level 4, it definitely has plenty of the natural-like intensity that you would expect from a coffee like this, most notably in the fruit sense. It's definitely very fruit-forward in the sweetness, so I'm happy with that, scoring there at the level 4 mark. Acidity level 4, I think that might have been a little bit of a surprise, given that there's a fair bit more brightness than I might have expected within this coffee, but I think it's because this coffee in general does tend to be a little bit more uneven overall, so there is plenty of brightness in that sense. Florals, level 4, and what's so interesting about the floral components to this one is it feels like a washed Gesha in terms of the florals. Like, it has that very sort of washed Gesha floral feel to it, but in a much more pronounced and intense sense to it, given that it is a natural processed coffee. So plenty of the white flowers. I'm happy with it scoring there at the level 4, though truth be told, it's not something I mentioned too much, mostly because it came about a lot more in the later days of this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 4. One of the things that I feel like has maybe been underutilized and under-discussed within this coffee, mostly because it's been dominated by the more intense profiles in terms of the stone fruits. So the citrus fruit also scoring there at the level 4 was a little bit more of that classic Gesha-like feel once again as well, in a little bit more intense of a sense, given that this is a natural. So that is also pretty interesting. Stone fruit level 4, I mentioned at times it has that paraíso-like feel to it in terms of that mango, which can feel a little bit more funky. But towards the end, it has a combination of that and a much more sugary peach. So I'm actually happy with that scoring there at that level 4 mark, given that it turned out cleaner by the end. Though most of the time when I was working with it, I felt like it was a little strange within this coffee. And then we have one level 3, that is the caramel level 3. This coffee, as mentioned, was very sugary and candied, so it's kind of interesting that that scored as high as it did, as it's not something that I was necessarily expecting from this coffee either. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2. As this one did have a lighter body, that's a lot more in line with the expectations. We have an Ethiopian Gesha, which I think on paper could score even lower than that level 2, but it still had enough body and structure to it that I said, okay, it's not quite tea-like, let's push that up a little bit, as it does have some slight texture to it. Outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Among the Terraform coffees that we reviewed that we received from Airworks, this one's probably my favorite, mostly because it's the one that took the most amount of work to get right, but I feel like I was rewarded by the end for getting this coffee right, mostly because it did turn out very nice, in line with a lot of the things that I hope for in coffee. Nice clarity, nice sweetness, great florality, and great fruit components, all of which came out in a notably more clean sense than expected for a natural processed coffee. So that in itself is a win. Even then, this coffee isn't perfect. There are still some things that seem to be holding it back. That interesting funk, the amount of work it takes to get this one right, that interesting slightly off finish to this one. So it's a mixed bag by the end, and I'm not entirely sure whether I like this coffee more or the LRL, and I think maybe the LRL did benefit from it kind of being at the tail end of when I was supposed to be drinking it. I got that coffee a lot later than I got any of these other Terraform coffees, and in a weird way, I do think that benefited that coffee, because all these coffees seemed to be kind of wonky at times. They weren't necessarily the most consistent. They did take a little bit more work in general to kind of get right. And I just attributed that LRL to kind of dropping off because of how late it had been within that coffee. But as I've kind of worked through these coffees, I felt like this is just kind of the way these coffees in general do tend to be. They're not necessarily the most even and consistent for the entirety of the time that you are working through them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like your heavier, more syrupy fruit tones, and I feel like this one's a very good fit for you, especially in terms of the stone fruit aspects. That was by far the most predominant component within this one. In addition to that, it does have plenty of classic Gesha-like feels to it in a much more pronounced sense. So those are two really strong positives I can experience from this one. In addition to that, very high level of sweetness and a much higher than expected level of clarity. Best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gesha Village 118, natural processed Ethiopia from Terraform Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.